Hello, everyone. Welcome to 66 Portland Place. I'm Simon Alford. I'm the president of the RIBA. Thank you for joining us all in this third talk, the third of 5, in our RIBA and VitrA autumn season of talks. Wellbeing, well built. That's quite a big challenge, actually. And it's a program that explores how architects and designers can shape the environments and spaces we all inhabit to create places that enhance our sense of well-being, both physically and mentally. And I think it's particularly pertinent to talk about the quality of what we do, because at the moment, and I with others from here will be at COP27 in Egypt, but a lot of the conversation is about measuring important things like carbon, embodied and operational carbon. But we can't, it would be very dangerous if we got the import of making sure that whatever we do is adding to the quality of life. No one will keep a place or a building if it doesn't bring pleasure and joy to future generations. And this talk is part of our ongoing partnership with VitrA Bathrooms, and I'd like to thank VitrA Bathrooms for sponsoring these talks. It's very important, this engagement. VitrA are working together with the RIBA to explore a wide-ranging survey of topics, projects, and innovative new ideas about the way society is rethinking the relationship between the built environment and our physical and mental health. And I'm sure some of you will have been to the previous talks and will come to the next ones. Our environment and the spaces we inhabit influence and impacts upon our behaviour, our relationships, how we interact with each other. And of course, we all know that after what we've been through over the last few years. And, it's all about, how places engender engagement, community, and emotions with, emotional engagement in a positive way with others. As architects and designers shaping these spaces, it's very much about experiencing nature, the details, and how we fit into the bigger ecosystem of the world around us. It's not about us rebuilding a world for us. It's us rebuilding a world for us that accommodates other species, from invertebrates onwards. But it's also about creating environments that enhance, that lift the spirit, that boosts morale and moods. And, I think again, we were just talking about this earlier, this idea that the coming together, the convening, the conversation that you might all have informally afterwards, wherever you are, upstairs, elsewhere, that's an incredibly important part of what the architecture and the built environment does, or enables, or encourages, or facilitates. We're looking through this program with VitrA Bathrooms to look at the pressing issues of today, and the two people who will talk later will be introduced. We'll talk about the physical, digital, and societal infrastructures that we need to engender healthier living. But there's also a particular focus today on designing biophilic spaces that help us connect with nature. There are measures for this. There's an urban greening factor that we have in the City of London has one, where it's a complicated measure. I think measurement is good because it helps, regulation helps us drive ourselves to think differently. It helps us with our clients to collaborate differently. It helps us to engage with other designers. But of course, you can't measure happiness, joy, and delight, or maybe you can measure it, but it's a certainly less precise science. And I think that's the things that we can't measure sometimes get forgotten. So that's very, very important. Other topics in the series include well-being, well-built, include an exploration in the importance of colour. And the programme concludes with a keynote from Carlos Marino on his vision for a 15-minute city. So time, scale, and movement is part of this idea of well-being. But back to tonight's talk. I'm very much looking forward to our presentations this evening, to hearing our two speakers. We're very grateful to Amanda Sturgeon and Dr. Ken Yeang, who are joining us this evening to share their insights, their work, their experience, their thoughts. That fits in with the idea of the RIBA as a place of discussion and debate where different voices are heard. And again, in the kind of rapidly changing world we all live in, an idea about discourse, discussion, hearing voices that are different to your own, and being challenged, I think, is absolutely vital. Both Amanda Sturgeon and Ken Yeang have spent their careers exploring an approach to biophilic design, and they'll talk about their journey, about their journey integrating nature into our built environment. Following the presentations, we're grateful to Oliver Heath for joining us to chair a conversation and to navigate the topic further. So Oliver is the founder of Oliver Heath Design, an architectural interior design practice focusing on delivering health and well-being in the built environment. Oliver's work stimulates the adoption of happier, healthier places to live and work through his practice's work in research, design, and as advocates. This is what today is about, advocating and explaining and exploring. I think it's great that you're all here. I am a great believer in the non-meta world, the real world of people and chance encounter. But I'd also say what's also good when questions come up is the whole event is recorded so it can go up on our YouTube channel and be shared with members and the public around the world. So, I think that is one of the great advantages of the new world, is the ability that a great audience here tonight, and I'm looking forward to the conversation, but that audience can then grow over time, and we can become a virtual as well as a physical place of debate. But thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you to our speakers. I'd like to welcome Oliver onto the stage, who will take it from here. Thank you, Oliver.
So, thank you for joining us today. I'm going to reset this one. We're going to be talking about building a biophilic future, and I would say beyond. I spent much of the last 10 years traveling around England, Europe, the Middle East, and Far East teaching architects and interior designers about this emerging style and design and ethos of biophilic design. And it's something that is clearly sort of gaining traction. And I think it's important, before we dive into the incredible work of Amanda and Ken, just to outline what biophilic design is. So biophilia quite literally means a love of nature, and it explains humans' innate attraction to nature and to natural processes. It's a term that was kind of invented by the social psychologist Erich Fromm and developed with Edward O. Wilson, the American biologist, when they realized society's departure away from rural dwellings and into city centers and the many physiological and psychological problems that came from living in our noisy, cramped, urban, geometric spaces. Now, that idea of humans having an innate attraction to nature was picked up by the social ecologist Stephen Kellett, who developed it into a series of what we call patterns or principles or features that can be adopted into the built environment to strengthen that human-nature connection. So biophilia essentially explains why we like being in nature, why when we have to move away from the built environment, we tend to choose in our holidays to go to the beaches, to the mountains, to the forest, to alleviate stress, to aid recuperation, to get back to being at our best. So this idea that Stephen Kellett was aiming for was kind of eliciting a similar physical and emotional response in the built environment that we found when we're deeply immersed in nature. Now, it's essentially an evolutionary approach that recognizes that as human beings, we've evolved for 99.5% of our time in very close connection to flourishing natural systems as a means for our basic human survival. So now we find ourselves in the modern day built environment. It's essential to recognize that we still have essentially a genetic inheritance that still allows us to recognize spaces that can support life, spaces that are healthy, that are spaces where we don't just survive, but also thrive and flourish. So in a way, it is what we call a universal design ethos. It's a design style that almost everybody can relate to, in as much as it relates to that kind of those wonderful moments that we all spend in nature and connects us to our local ecology and the local sense of identity and seeks to remind us of that. Now, what people don't tend to know about is the fact that there's actually two approaches. One is what we call a neuroscientific approach. So it essentially looks at how nature improves us individually, how it helps to reduce stress and heart rates and blood pressure levels, how it helps us to recuperate from intense periods of physical and mental activity. It gets us back to being at our best. The other is what we call a socio-psychological approach. It's how, when we introduce elements of nature, it improves our general experience of space by putting us in a calmer, more open and optimistic frame of mind. And as a result of that, it deepens our connection to a sense of space and place, but also the people in that space. And as a result, enhance human connections and a sense of community to the spaces where nature is incorporated. Now, both of these approaches have three core principles to them. The first is what we call a direct connection to nature. It's how we connect with real sensory forms of nature, be that natural light and fresh air or water, gentle movement or the changes in the season, and of course, plants and trees. The second is what we call an indirect connection to nature. And this is how we mimic or evoke a feeling of nature in the built environment, using natural materials, colors, textures, shapes, forms, and even technologies. And the third is the human spatial response, or the experience of space and place. So this covers ideas such as prospect, retreat, mystery, and a sense of awe. It essentially looks at how nature has informed many of the experiences that we still have in the built environment and allows us to live in a better, healthier way. Now, one of the most interesting things about biophilic design is that it's what we call an evidence-based approach. It's based on 30 years of studies by environmental psychologists that demonstrate that when we bring elements of nature or that mimic nature into the built environment, it can do two basic things. It can improve building outcomes whilst reducing negative costs. And what this evidence shows again and again over studies throughout the last 30 years is that there are multiple benefits in the built environment through this enhancement of a connection to nature, to all building typologies. We can create schools and education spaces where children learn faster and get better test results. Healthcare facilities where patients can recuperate faster and even feel less pain. Hospitality spaces that people want to spend more time in, to book up more quickly. Workplaces that are more productive, more effective, more engaging, that connect people together and facilitate conversations. And also homes that are more calming and restorative, and also set us up for the challenges that we face in the day ahead. Now, our conversation today will inevitably begin with Amanda discussing this human-nature connection in the built environment. But as we're going to see, it's very quickly going to move on from the human-centered approach to connecting with nature into the realms of regenerative design around ecosystem services, bioclimatic buildings, biodiversity matrix, targets, net gain, and biointegration. So it's going to be a really fascinating evening of conversation and discussion. And to help us explore and unpack all of this, we have two industry thought leaders and practitioners in Amanda Sturgeon and Dr. Ken Yeang. So firstly, Amanda Sturgeon, who's going to get up and talk first. Amanda is the CEO of Built by Nature, a philanthropy and network focused on accelerating buildings that are built in unison with nature. She's an award-winning architect, consultant, and non-profit leader. As the former CEO of the International Living Future Institute, she spent a decade creating regenerative frameworks such as the Living Building and Community Challenge programs, scaled the organization globally, and created a global movement around biophilic design. Amanda is a fellow of the American Institute of Architects, author of Creating Biophilic Buildings, a TED speaker on bringing biophilic design to life, and has an essay in the anthology, All We Can Save, Truth, Courage, and Solutions to Climate Change. Now, following Amanda, I'm just going to introduce them because they're going to kind of move up sequentially, is Dr. Ken Yeang of Hamza and Yeang. Ken is an architect and ecologist delivering his signature hyper-green architecture in a field he's pioneered since 1971. His work is differentiated by an ecosystem-based approach that performs beyond conventional green rating systems. His work has visually distinct, verdant green aesthetic that positively enhances its locality's ecology and biodiversity, designed as constructed systems. His work has received numerous awards, and when I say numerous, I'm literally going to run out of time if I tell you all of them, so I'm going to just move on, just be sure that he has won many awards over his career. His training was at the Architectural Association just down the road here in London. He received a doctorate from Cambridge University on ecological design and planning and remains an honorary fellow of Wolfson College. He is the distinguished Plim professor at Illinois University. Now, the format of the evening is that, following my introduction, Both Amanda and Ken are going to come up and introduce their work and their career for 20 minutes. Following that, we're going to have 20 minutes of conversation and discussion between the three of us, and then we're going to open up for questions from the floor. There'll be a roving microphone, and I'll say it now, but I'll reiterate it at the time. It would be great if you've got questions with a question mark at the end rather than a statement, as I will be cutting you off if it doesn't have a question mark. So that's just a nice, polite warning. So, to begin with, would you please give a big hand to Amanda Sturgeon?
Yeah, thank you for the introduction, Oliver. As he mentioned, I'm a fellow of the American Institute of Architects. I practiced as an architect for about 15 years, and then it's near on that amount of time that I've been working more in the advocacy space around buildings. So I'll track a little bit of that in my presentation around my trajectory to move from sort of pure architect, designer, to influencing and changing the way that we build and create the shelter that we live and work in. So I'm starting off with a slide here. It's a recent trek that I did across Central Australia. I do live in Sydney, Australia, but I work for an organization based in Amsterdam. I was born in the UK, then moved to Australia where I did my architectural training at University of Sydney, and then moved to the US and practiced there, and then back to Australia. So you might find some UK, Australian, US phrases in my voice. Sometimes people are confused about where I'm from, so just a bit of clarity. As Oliver mentioned, I've spent quite a bit of time talking about this connection between buildings and nature, but really that was the inherent passion with why I started studying architecture in the first place. I spent time traveling the world, about 2 years through Southeast Asia and Australia, Central America, before I went to architecture school, and really went to study architecture with the vision that we should be connecting our buildings with nature. I think I would have liked to have stayed traveling forever a part of me, and the idea of spending all my time inside a building, felt really restricting. So I was driven to really break down the walls of buildings and bring more of this nature connection into the spaces that we spend 90% of our time on. I spent some time really sort of investigating that in my practice. I'll show you a little bit of that, and then looking at how I could scale that and perhaps influence a little more broadly the built environment sector as a practice beyond actually designing buildings. The book that I wrote a few years ago, Creating Biophilic Buildings, is really looking at a range of different buildings across the world. Unfortunately, there aren't any in the UK and there, but in the US, Australia, New Zealand, predominantly, and into Asia, and looked at sort of the similarities and commonalities between them and how they might have actually created this people-nature connection. It brought in some of the work that Oliver mentioned of Stephen Kellett and other thinkers around what might lie sort of behind this people-nature connection in buildings, and how we might be able to be more aware of that as we design and create them. This is a slide sort of showing some of those projects that are featured in the book, and some of the, a couple of these projects I'll talk a little bit about. I've also become quite an advocate for how buildings can influence the global climate crisis and the impending biodiversity collapse that I think we will see within the next decade. I felt that with good conscience I could no longer be a practicing architect. The way that buildings are actually contributing negatively towards climate change and biodiversity collapse. And that was really sort of at the basis of me becoming much more of an advocate, looking at how we could shift the industry. A little bit of that is in this essay and a couple of other articles I've written for newspapers like The Guardian and such, really advocating for how this shift towards the connection between buildings and nature could actually help us to both decarbonize the built environment as well as reduce its impact on biodiversity, and start to help us move towards what I call a regenerative way of designing buildings that would actually allow us to create positive impacts for both climate, biodiversity, and communities through what we build in the cities that we live in. I'm an enormous David Attenborough fan, so I have a couple of quotes. I think the last documentary he did chronicling his life over the last 50 years, with his unique vision of seeing the sort of destruction of nature around the world. He's really had quite an influence, I think, on bringing the sort of stories and the lessons of different ecosystems to all of us. And, you know, I think he said a very powerful quote in his last documentary, Life on Earth, which was that until, you know, we value the preservation of nature as much as we value the destruction of nature, we won't change at all. And that's really sort of influenced the current role that I have, which is running a nonprofit and philanthropy organization based in Amsterdam that's focused on shifting the materials that we build buildings from, away from concrete and steel. That, you know, concrete, for example, as you may know, is responsible for 17% alone of the world's carbon emissions, towards more bio-based materials that can have positive impacts on biodiversity, reforestation, and community well-being. And it's clear also, another quote from him, that you know, we've reached a limit to what we can destroy in terms of our ecosystems and biodiversity, and that it's possible for us to actually turn this around and to create a wild planet again. So the work that I've been focused on, especially in the last decade, but probably throughout my career, is very much focused on this regenerating of ecosystems, from urban wildness through to actually community and rural wildness at times. So a project that I worked on very early in my career, in the sort of late 90s, was a project on the home island where I lived for about 24 years outside of Seattle. This was a project where it used to be the site of the largest sawmill in the world, and there was a process of regenerating that damage and really looking at how you could then actually bring also at-risk youth and others to learn about how you might regenerate ecosystems. It was a project that was pushing kind of some of this, you know, net zero concepts back in the, you know, sort of late 90s, and figuring out how we could actually reuse all of the wastewater. This is a living machine on site, and how we might be able to create closed loop systems for both energy and water from the project. All of the materials were harvested on site, experimenting about how we might be able to do that at, you know, this relatively small scale compared to some of the work we might see later, but a reasonable size scale for some of this technology. I then spent quite a few years working on larger scale projects, university education buildings. This is the Student Union building at University of Washington in Seattle. And this is actually a renovation of an existing building that had multiple additions to it, that was sort of a maze with no natural light. Cut basically a very large atrium through the middle of it and brought in wood and other you know, materials to bring a sort of sense of community into the heart of the space. And then, you know, becoming fairly disillusioned actually through that project with the slow pace of change in the built environment industry in terms of sustainability or regenerative thinking, I then left to join the International Living Future Institute, and later became its CEO, that was working with projects like this one, which is the Bullitt Center in Seattle. This project was aiming to be the most sustainable project in the world. It takes the most ubiquitous type of building in the US, which is the 6-story office building on the edges of cities, and looked to create a model for it to become a net zero building, as well as, again, it harvests its own water, treats its own wastewater on site, produces more energy than it needs from a rooftop solar system, changed regulations in Seattle and created a new policy, and also brought new technologies to the US that weren't there before, and created new industries, all doing it very transparently at the same cost as any other Class A type office building in Seattle, with, in the end, a much faster return on investment. So the idea of doing this project was, how do we get the rest of the developers of these, you know, sort of 6-story commercial buildings that are, across the entire US to do this when we can show that it pencils, that, it's feasible from every perspective. It took about, the building's probably about 10 years old, and now we're seeing developers mimicking it throughout the industry. But it took a little while, but it got there. So that was really the pivot of my career, from practicing architecture to figuring out how I could, rather than design myself, relatively small amount of projects, to how could I influence thousands or tens of thousands of buildings to move the industry much faster towards where we needed to go. And I sort of really picked up my advocacy work through the programs that I authored at the International Living Future Institute, including the Living Building Challenge. There are hundreds of projects that have pursued this challenge across the world, many of which I helped support and consult on, and it was an iterative program, learning from projects while reiterating them into a sort of a program to see if we could actually scale this. And the program has been adopted for some fairly large-scale projects for Google and Microsoft, for example, also Harvard, across the US. So it's been able to have some influence to show people what the future might be of where we might be able to head. Some projects closer to home to where I now live. This is a project that's a living building. I'm not part of the design team here, but helped consult on the biophilic design aspects. And this project is a regular old shopping center in suburban Melbourne. It takes the model of, the cinema, the grocery store, the lots of small cafes and nail salons, the standard sort of a type of building that we see, and transforms it. It has a urban farm on the roof. What you're seeing here is actually a partnership with Aboriginal communities to tell the stories of connecting with country, which I'll talk a little bit more about on the ceiling. This has now become one of the most popular retail centers, therefore driving up, revenue for the developer, and shows that there's another way to think about these types of projects to what we're used to building and designing. One of the most profound projects for me personally that I've worked alongside during that time was Te Kure Whare. This is a project for the Tūhoe Maori in New Zealand, the South Island. The Tūhoe did not sign the treaty to give over their land to the colonizers, but had it taken anyway. Some years ago, there was a settlement, a financial settlement, an acknowledgement of this. The local river in this community now has its own rights to nature. And the national park reverted back to Maori stewardship. This project, again, was very much a healing project for the community. It was about closing the door on the past and opening it for the future. Again, what I was interested in this work was the leverage points for how you might do these types of projects and then see the ripple effects happen across an industry. In this case, the Tūhoe Maori are now building and designing multiple community villages across their territory. But I think most profoundly, when I visited the building for the first time when it was built, this whole houses a lot of social services for the community to really recover. Most of the community is in relative poverty, lots of social challenges, unemployment. And the social services in this building are really designed to, as I said, close a door on the past and open it for the future. And when I was touring, they were like, someday we won't need any of this, these, sort of services in this building. And I was confused. And they elaborated that, in 2 or 3 generations, we'll have closed that door and we'll have fully, reinvigorated our cultural values and our connection to land. And therefore, this building won't be needed. And I think from then on, for me, it was a profound sort of shift of thinking about buildings as finished when we design and, and hand over the keys, the occupancy happens, to thinking about the impact that buildings have across multiple generations, and not ever thinking really of a building as finished and done. So over the last few years, I've sort of expanded my consulting role and been working at much larger scales. This is the Bays West neighborhood in Sydney. There's quite a lot of large-scale redevelopment proposed in Sydney, together with the new Sydney Metro, about 25 or so different stations and redevelopments and precincts as Sydney expands and brings in its first underground train system. And experimenting with what it would be like to have a regenerative and resilient harbourfront and redevelopments that could potentially start repairing and restoring ecosystems, and also provide resilience for future climate change, weather events, and the changes we're likely to see. As an example, sort of thinking about the edges of these projects as the ability to, both house birds for nesting, help to restore, marine species, but also be a place for people to interact. And so you're starting to see this sort of the theme to my architectural career and my nonprofit career, which has been very much about how do we bring this people and nature connection together more profoundly, and how do we shift our society to understand that we are not separate from nature, but we are actually part of nature. As is another project that I've worked on quite recently, this is in Queenstown on the South Island of New Zealand, which is also a fairly large redevelopment project, looking at how this project could actually create positive outcomes for ecosystems and help to ensure long-term health and vibrancy of the lake that you see in this picture. So across my career, I've really worked on what I call the 4 dimensions of biophilic design. The first being, the biodiversity of place that can extend to planetary boundaries, the watershed, and certainly sort of the site of the building, and really thinking about what those ecosystems are, how we create biodiversity net gain across that system, and think about the building as part of that ecosystem. The other place that I'm playing in more recently is around then how do we think about the materiality of that building to be bio-based. Our concrete and steel buildings have an enormous impact on biodiversity. We might not see it at the building site, but I can assure you I'm seeing it in Australia when you see 75% of the biodiversity lost in Australia. Australia provides many of the minerals to the rest of the world. If you've got a phone, the lithium from it probably came from Australia. So really thinking much more consciously about the impact of the materials that we're building with. The third, of course, is sort of the energy and resource use. I think there's been a lot more activity around that in the built environment. And the fourth being the connection to nature, which Oliver talked about, this connection between people and nature. And that was really at the core of my book and some of the work I've done around biophilic design, which is, this realization that actually we can't be healthy as a species unless we're taking care of the ecosystems that we're part of. So our health is dependent upon the health of nature, not just at the site of the building, but across where all the resources came from for that building, and wherever the energy and food is coming from to keep that building operating. I've got the benefit in Australia of being amidst a very profound and very ancient indigenous culture from the Australian Aboriginals, and I'm learning a lot continuously about what that means to live together with a country and nature and ecosystem. There's a great Connecting with Country, it's called, framework that's emerged in Australia. This is one of the diagrams from it that's really trying to move us from this sense that we're designing for people only, but we're actually designing for all the species, not just at that site, but scaling out towards a planetary context. This is a diagram that our team created for a project that I was working on, starting to map all the different species. This is the river system on which we were designing. For example, pretty incredible river system, tributaries, the kinds of species that we were identifying, and as well together with the people, and thinking about how this whole sort of ecosystem all works together in our sort of design solutions, and how we provide a place for them all to thrive. So that's moved me sort of from biophilic design to some extent towards a regenerative design approach, which is what I've been practicing on the sort of larger scale projects in the most recent years. And this is how I classify regenerative design, that we're really trying to enable the relationships between people and nature to thrive together and to evolve over time. As Oliver said, biophilic design and its element is really about this connection between people and nature. We won't save, we won't, incorporate into our projects what we don't love and value. And in that way, I think David Attenborough has it right. So biophilic design is about bringing in both these direct connections through the actual nature you might bring into a project, but also the indirect, more subtle, well, that tells me I'm almost out of time, more subtle connections to nature. I think of these as a continual nesting relationship, of which I sort of scale in and out on projects. So they're not distinctly separate from each other, but biophilic design is really a regenerative design approach. And for me, practicing and working in Australia, there's always the Aboriginal connection to country as well that is overlapping. As I mentioned, for biophilic design, there's the direct nature connection of how we might bring nature into the building. There's natural patterns and processes that are how we, think about nature in terms of geometries, imagery, biomimicry, for example. And then there's the connection to place and culture. So for biophilic design projects, and I consult on quite a few, I'm always moving between these sort of three aspects. This is just to elaborate a little bit on what Oliver talked about in terms of Stephen Kellett's design elements. There's a lot more to discover about biophilic design that goes quite a bit deeper. This is actually an image from my book, but you can find these resources from Stephen Kellett's thinking as well online that really starts to provide a sort of map or a guide for how you might incorporate nature within architecture. So with that, I'll close with just the saying that, it's a real Aboriginal motto that if you take care of country, it will take care of us. And I'll extend that to say, if we take care of the natural world and really understand and enrich our biodiversity and ecosystems with the projects that we design, then we'll be okay as people and we will be able to thrive and be healthy. Thank you very much.
Well, I'm going to talk about the work I've been researching and designing for the last few years. It's essentially about ecology-based design. So I'll start by asking the question, what is ecology-based design? I defined it as designing with nature based on the science of ecology. Why ecology-based design? Well, the planet's ecology, as Amanda mentioned, is the environmental context for all human activity, including our technology and building activity. The viability of all life is dependent on the planet's ecological health. We don't have a healthy ecology, we don't have a future for humanity. And I contend that ecology-based design is environmentally more holistic, because it encompasses both the natural world and the built world, or the physical world. So I'll start by talking a little bit about the ecology of the planet. Ecology sees the Earth as covered by this thin film called the biosphere, where all life exists, organisms. And within the biosphere, there are units called ecosystems, which consist of communities of plants and animals acting together as a whole. So holistic property is the unique property of organisms, which is very different from technological systems, which tend not to be holistic. Now, ecosystems interact in very complex ways. They're invisible. A lot of these we cannot see with the visible eye, but they take place. And so when you look out into nature, all these activities, the interactions take place. And unless you study ecology, you wouldn't be aware of these things happening. And so I contend that everybody should study ecology, and that schools of architecture should change their curriculum to include ecology. Now, within the species in nature, that's us as human beings. We are the most powerful of all species. We're different from other species in nature in that we're able to change the landscapes, we change waterways, now we're able to change the climate and change soils. And so, if we have this amazing, incredible power, as Spider-Man says, we have to exercise this power with great care. Now, we as human beings, we make things. We make things more than any other species in nature. And we clutter the world with things. We throw it into the physical environment, and the waste goes back to the biosphere. Now, herein lies the problem, because what happens is that we carelessly throw everything into the biosphere, thinking that we're going to throw things away. But there's no such thing as away, because the Earth, the planet, is a closed system. So everything goes back to the planet, and that's when contamination and pollution and devastation of the environment takes place. So my thesis is that we should remake the built environment as human-made ecosystems so that it's able to biointegrate seamlessly and benignly with the natural environment. So this is a challenge. This is easier said than done, but this is what I've been trying to do a good part of my life. So the answer to me is to remake the built environment as constructed ecosystems to synergistically biointegrate with nature. So I started to research on what are the attributes and properties of ecosystems that we try and emulate, replicate, and augment in as much as we can. Now this then becomes my life's agenda. I haven't been able to achieve all of it, but this is what I've been trying to do. I hope the next generation of architects will pick this up and make it work. The most important thing that I started with is looking at the biological structure of the built environment. Now, if you look at this room that you're in, everything in this room is inorganic, except you, me, and the bugs. So where is the biological constituents? That's the biotic constituents. And so earlier on, maybe 20, 30 years ago, I started to think about how I can bring greenery back into the built environment. But more than just putting veggies on buildings, I tried to make them into habitats. And the habitats could be on the roof, on the walls, in terraces, in balconies, inside the building, on the ground, and in open spaces that we have surrounding buildings. And so I started to do research on what are the patterns we could relate nature to buildings. The first one is this pattern, which I call the centralized pattern, where you put everything just like that, as Tommy Cooper says, in one location. Or you could have a spotty relationship. So the first one's like Central Park in New York. Second is like Georgia in London, where you have a series of squares, Tavistock Square, Russell Square, Euston Square. It's patchy. But ideally, we need to be connected, because in nature, everything's connected. What we human beings do is that we chop up nature and we cut it up with walls, drains, roads, impervious surfaces. And so the third pattern is what I call stepping stone. Nature's connected, but not quite. Some species can move across from one patch to another patch, but not all species. So the third is what I call a tree relationship, where you have a stem of a tree and you have fingers sticking out. But the ideal one is this one, which is where nature is connected. By being connected, it enables a larger pool of natural resources to be shared among the species, and as a result, it engenders a much more stable ecosystem. And so with these as the starting point, maybe 10, 15 years ago, I started to experiment and see how I could interpret these into building form. So this is a building that I did about 35 years ago, where I started to put vegetation and plants in the building, but it's a spotty relationship. You can see on the left side, it is not satisfactory, but it was an early experiment. And so you can see the terraces with the vegetation along the corners. So this was done back in 1985. And that, so The next was an experiment in the stepping stone relationship. This is a design where this is the first building I did for IBM, where we had a series of terraces that climbs up the building. Of course, halfway up the building, you run out of the building, so we brought the vegetation across the floor. And I called the client as the plant room. And then on the other side goes all the way up. And this is a much more recent building that we did about 10 years ago, where we had a vegetated wall, which starts from one part of the site, goes across the site, goes across the left-hand side, the back, and then back to the ground again. So this was one of the early experiments in putting vegetation in buildings and in a continuous way. So the next topic I started looking at is biodiversity. How do we design to enhance the biodiversity location? Now, you see this histogram is really the biodiversity of a particular butterfly. And you can see the biodiversity is a diagram, and it's indicative of biodiversity in the planet. And that the nearer the equator, the higher the level of biodiversity. You can see that here in London, you're 52 degrees above the equator. You're reasonably biodiverse, but not as biodiverse as it is in the low parts of the latitude. So this building that we finished about 3-4 years ago, and here we created habitats within these areas, in the terraces, in the central promenade, on the rooftops, and on the ground. And so that's the first thing we do when we design. We try and create habitats within the building form. Habitats are places where species live, and we're trying to create as many habitats as we can, or as much as the client will let us, permit us to do it. And so these are the different habitats, on the ground, on the walls, in the roof, in balconies, and so forth. And so first thing we do then is to, having identified the habitats, we do research on the species around the site, and to identify faunal species that we want to bring back to the site. So on the left-hand column here, this axis, these are the faunal species we want to bring back to the site. But the faunal species don't come to the site by itself. So we did the research on the flora that will attract the faunal species. And then once we do that, we look at the interaction with the habitats, and then we use that as a basis for designing the habitats. So I call this the biodiversity approach, looking into the locality, looking into the species in its proximity, selecting the appropriate species that we want to bring back to the site, which had been removed from the site by human beings, because they just cleared the site of all vegetation and animal life. One of the ideas we had is what we call the eco-cell. Eco-cell is a way of bringing vegetation all the way up from the building through a series of ramps going down to the basement. We developed this idea, about 20 years earlier. This is our master plan for the Kowloon waterfront. We didn't win the competition, but I think we got honorary mention. I didn't get any dosh for doing that. But anyway, the idea was to cut voids from the roof garden and to bring the vegetation all the way down to the basement, the lower parts of the basement. So this provides vertical integration of vegetation to the lower parts of the building, provides opportunity for rainwater harvesting, brings natural ventilation to the lower parts of the building, brings daylight, and at the bottom of the building you could either put a biosphere or one of John Todd's living machine. So this was the eco-cell idea that we had for all our buildings. For this particular building that you saw just now, there are two axes in this city, which is the capital city of Kuala Lumpur. That's the city, that's the main boulevard that leads to the Prime Minister's office. And then there's the one at an angle that leads to the Millennium Monument, which is here, this is the Millennium. Oh, this is the axis, and in between, there's the promenade, and the promenade is created as enjoyable, pleasurable space for human beings, for users. And that the aesthetic for the building is a gem, and we faceted the facade. And in the white square there's the habitats where we create in the balconies. The building is actually an experimental building where we did use conventional sunshade. We used fritted glass as a sunshade. So it's about 50% fritted, and here we use a cultural pattern for the glass. The glass is not butt jointed. There's an air gap so the air can go through, so that people can walk in this passageway between the inner skin and the outer skin. And here's the passageway, the outer skin. And that's the view of the outer skin from the outside. That's about 50% fitted. And this is the view from the inside to the outside. But we angled the sun shading on the west side because it's not exactly north-south, so to address the hot western sun. The typical office building in Malaysia uses about 210 kilowatt hours per square meter per annum. But with the filtered glass sun shading, it's about 70% less, about 136. We could have improved the energy performance, but I could not do this with this building for one reason or the other. And here, that's the axis that explains the building form. We had a certain plot ratio of GFA that we have to build, and so we had to comply with this axis. The building's actually two almost symmetrical chevron-shaped buildings that leads to the monument at the bottom by the waterfront, which was also designed by us about 8 years earlier. Here's the monument, and here's the monument in the context of the environment. The metaphor for the monument is the national flower, which is hibiscus, and we use the petals of flower as a way of shaping the ramps that lead up to the top of the monument. And there's the monument with the Ministry of Finance building on the opposite side. Now, how do you apply this idea of biodiversity to the high-rise building? And so we took this pattern, which is a tree with fingers sticking out, and then we had a series of pods from the tree, and the pods then becomes, if you like, areas where we can soak up rainwater, which is reutilized and collected for harvesting. It's also a place for vegetation. Again, like the other project, we look at the ecology, away from the site, look at the ecology of the land near the site. And so we started to find out what species we want to bring back to this building. So the idea was to look into birds and other species that we bring in. And for this scheme, for the lower floors, we have butterflies and dragonflies. The middle floors, we want to attract, choose the flora that will attract the songbirds and the migratory birds for the upper parts of the building. So this is the biodiversity matrix for this project. And that's the upper floor where we had four swimming pools to attract the birds. We have a lap pool, family pool, children's pool, and a jacuzzi pool, and that's the upper parts of the building. Now the next idea we start to look at is continuity, because in nature everything's connected. It's us as human beings that chop things up by roads, by drains, by sewer lines, by fences, by impervious surfaces. And so this was a scheme where we thought, well, what happens if we design based on the pattern that I showed earlier on, where we had a series of spiraling vegetation going all the way up to the top. And so the building's not built, it's a design that we did in Singapore, for the Waterloo Road in Singapore. So we had plants going all the way around to the top. And the idea was that whenever the spiral plant reaches the level of the roof of the adjoining building, we bridge across and we green the roofs of the building. So in this way, the building then becomes a device for greening the city. It's just an idea, but it's never been fully adopted. And so we thought, well, that's a great idea. We're going to have ramps along the facades of the building. With every facade, I climb one floor. And so in this way, the ramp goes all the way up to the top of the building. And this is the Solaris building that was completed soon after that. And here we had vegetation. It goes, as you can see, weaves its way up from the ground going up to the top of the building. This is an inspirational drawing that we did. So this time we put a walkway next to the planting so that you can service the planting without going through the user spaces. So you can see the walkway there, you can see the vegetation, you can see it on top. It took about 8 years from the first concept of the other building before this one got built. And as I tell people, architect's an old man's game. You have to be patient and eventually get your idea being built. So you can see the walkway, vegetation, the sun shading at the top. You can see the facade, which is shaded by the plants and vegetation. Some parts of the walkway is narrows, and that. Now in Singapore, they have a greenery index of 6, which is the amount of vegetation that you put in the building in relation to the original vegetation on the site. Now this particular building, the vegetation index is 12. And so we've doubled the requirement written by the authorities. What I'm trying to say is that all accreditation systems are just figures that somebody dreamed up. We should exceed this as much as we can. Now, because of this linear walkway, we call it the linear park in the sky, and if you stretch it out, it's 1.3 kilometers long, but it's a pretty dreary sort of, monotonous route. So what we did was at the corners of the building, we create plazas. So these are many plazas attached to this linear park. And this is where people can go out and have a puff they want to do, have a snack, or have a transitional space they can go to in between working inside the office and outside. The building actually consists of a skin, which just consists of 2 building forms within it. And within the 2 building forms is this atrium, and above the atrium is a glass roof that lets hot air out. And so most days it is open, and that has sensors so that in case if it rains, it automatically shuts to keep the rain out. And so this atrium space is not air conditioned, but it has cold air blown into it, but it's a low energy space. So now, one of the properties of the ecosystem, which is probably the most important property that we have to emulate, replicate, and augment, is ecosystem services. Now, this is a list of eco-services that nature provides for us without human intervention. It's done for us for free. But if we continue to deforest the planet, if we continue to reduce the vegetation and biodiversity, reduce nature's capability to provide ecosystem services. So we need to be able to improve and enhance nature's ability to ecosystem services. But this is an extremely difficult thing to do. It's easier said than done. For instance, nature produces oxygen, and it sequesters pollution within the limited capability. But in reality, it is impossible for human beings technologically to imitate and replicate nature's ability to provide ecosystem services. So do we give up, or what do we do? So the solution I had was that let's make use of nature, let's collaborate with nature. And so this was the pattern that I showed earlier on, which have ecological corridors, ecological fingers that eat into the city. And so that in this way, there's like 2 class hands. You have vegetation from the waterfront, which collects all the species. We bring it into the island. This is a master plan we did for the island of Reunion, which is east of Madagascar. And so with vegetation climbing in. But in between the vegetation is an urban realm. So it is, it's a sort of weaving of vegetation with urban areas, so that we can get the ecosystem service in proximity to vegetation. I mean, just like in London, you have Hyde Park and Regent's Park, that's great. But, it's miles away from Hackney. So, you need to have a very close relationship. And the studies we did is that we should be about 30 meters for the urban realm, and the vegetated areas is about 20 meters. So this becomes the scheme for bringing ecosystem services by collaboration and augmentation of nature. So you bring vegetation in and the urban realm in between, and that you have roads cutting across this. So the idea we had is what we call the eco-undercroft. The vegetation goes underneath the roads. So this is a scheme, and that's the building form for this project. Now, the edges for these fingers should not be pristine, because we need to be serrated, we need to be jagged, because this enables species to breed, this species to hide and encourage a higher level of biodiversity. So now, then I start to think, a lot of architects are doing very nice green buildings. Some of my friends are. But it's not enough. So to me, ecological design is the biodiversity, it's the biointegration. So this is one of the properties you can see on the left-hand side of the blue color, biointegration, which is as against segregation in our existing built environment of nature and all the components that are crucial in designing ecological building. So we start with nature. That is the first infrastructure. The second is us human beings, our social, economic, political, and institutional systems. So that is the infrastructure we need to integrate. Third is water. Now, water is actually part of nature, but I've taken it up because water is what life is all about. When astronomers look up into the skies and look into the asteroids and the planets, the first thing you look for is whether there's signs of water. If there's signs of water, that means there's signs of organic life. Then our built environment, our technological systems, our food production systems. And then finally, there's energy, because we are addicted to energy. We cannot exist without energy. So to me, ecological design is the integration of these 5 factors into whole: nature, human society and well-being, technological systems, energy, and water. Now, obviously, as I said, this is easier said than done. That is the challenge of ecological design. This is what I've been trying to do for a good part of my life, and try and interpret this into built form. So then, how do we do this? So this is a scheme that we did, a master plan we did in Bangalore, and you can see the green areas as nature. Next to it, the site is the forest reserve. We collect all the species, and we bring it as a series of fingers across the site to adjoining sites so that we can enhance the biodiversity of not just our site, but adjoining sites as well. And then, so this is the spine, and this is the fingers that we bring across to the site. This is the water system. Now, what we try to do with the water system is to close the loop as much as we can within our built environment. But in effect, in nature, the water that falls on the ground stays in the ground, sinks through the earth, going through and recharging groundwater. Right now, the water that falls on the ground goes onto the impervious surfaces, goes to drains, goes to rivers, and it's gone forever. So we need to try and bring the water back into the ground, as you can see in the pattern on the right-hand side, the series of diagrams on the right-hand side, through constructed wetlands, and through rain gardens. And for the black water, we need to bring it back to the ground and treat it in a natural way, through a constructed wetlands, through a series of ponds, so that by the time it reaches the last pond, it's almost potable. Now, the problem then begins when there's crisscrossing of our roads with our green, because the roads cut our green into 2. So these are where the road system cuts our green fingers. So what's the solution? The idea we used in this project is what we call the eco-bridge. So we bridge across the road, we bring vegetation from one part of the site to the other part of the site, and make nature whole again. So that's the summary of all the different components: nature, society, hydrology, structure, infrastructure, and energy, and a composite diagram. Now, I can't do so much within time and opportunities that I have. So I started to look at materials. Materials is a complex issue, because some materials have a high embodied energy, but it's easier to recycle. Like aluminum has the highest embodied energy, but it's the most easiest metal to recycle. Whereas steel, if you want to recycle steel, the amount of energy they use to recycle it is the same amount of energy required to make it in the first place. But with materials, we need to close the loop. From the outputs, we bring it back into the built environment. We try and reintegrate back to the biosphere. And this is my next area of research, where we try and reuse, recycle, and use materials which have a low embodied impact on the natural environment. Then I start to look at nature in terms of relationship with climate. So this is one of the properties you can see in the green, in the blue bar, that the whole Earth, the climate depends the ecology of that locality. So now how can we design with minimal energy consumption to lead to net zero energy and yet save the planet? So this is a diagram that I prepared. It's basically a process where we go from the left-hand side to right-hand side, from passive mode, which is designed with climate, means low energy, performance, and comfort, without the use of any mechanical electrical systems. The second you can see is mixed mode, which is some mechanical electrical systems. The third is full mode, which is conventional systems, which has to be low embodied energy, smart systems, and high efficiency. And the last one you can see is productive mode, which is making your own energy. So where you are now in the UK, where we are now in the UK, you have a cold winter and a hot summer, which is indicated by this blue line. Passive mode, through design with climate, we can improve the comfort conditions without the use of any energy mechanical electrical systems. But it can improve it only a little bit. We cannot reach the red line, which is conventional full mode systems. And then mixed mode means some mechanical electrical systems like using ceiling fans and exhaust ducts. And finally, the last one is, this is full mode, which is a high energy situation, which any engineers want us to adopt. Consistent temperature, humidity, air change throughout the whole year. We don't need that. And so the last endeavor is the mixed mode, which is productive mode. Now, back to this building that I showed earlier on. We start to look at how the building configuration, the core positions can lead to a low energy building. And so from the different core positions, where the central core, whether it's oriented north-south, whether it's angled to the east, angled to the west, the one in the red square is the lowest energy consumption. And so the building configuration affects the energy consumption of the building. So when you design a building, you have to start with the building configuration and orientation. And so that is the passive mode. The next is mixed mode. This is a shopping mall where existing mall, you can see in blue, is all air conditioned. So we propose that we should have mixed mode for certain areas, which is yellow areas, and so that this reduces the air conditioning load, air conditioning requirements of the building by using ceiling fans, vertical ceiling fans, horizontal ceiling fans. These are the research that we did on the impact of fans on the space. Now, the other approach in the UK is to reduce the seasons where we need air conditioning and reduce the period where we need to have heating. And so the idea then was to try and stretch the mid-seasons, which are nice time of the year, which is spring and autumn, into winter and into summer, so that the period for heating and a period for cooling is reduced, and this creates a sort of low energy building. This is a scheme that we did for the Great Ormond Street Children's Hospital in the Bloomsbury area. We created a flue in the facade building, and that the flue then sucks in the air in the mid-season, so that the bottom 3 floors, which are occupied by Walt Disney. All right, okay, yes. Right. All of us just told me to shut up. Okay, and the last one is productive mode, where we put photovoltaics on the outside of the building, and that now for productive mode to be efficient, the area of photovoltaics has to be at least 60% of your GFA. So that's why this sticks up. And this idea of a building as a power station where we put embodied photovoltaics into the glass. And then I'm going to end a minute. I'm going to show very quickly some experiments we do, what we call the umbrella building. So this is a building we did where we let in the morning sun. We organized louvers. We put louvers angled to keep out afternoon sun and after midday sun. This is the canopy for entrance. This is the canopy for station. This is the canopy over the University of Malaya where we use the fitted glass again next to each other. And then this is a canopy over a new station in Xiong'an, which is south of Beijing, which is where the new capital city for Beijing. And so this is back to the idea that we should start with infrastructure, because what is happening now, if the infrastructure is not green, all the buildings we put into the city will never make the city green. So we should start by making the infrastructure green. If you're going to make London into a green city, start with infrastructure green. Then anything else we put in will only enhance its greenness. And so this is the strategy you have towards the city. You should enhance the existing city, or mostly a biotic environment, increase biodiversity, create habitats, create ecosystem biointegration, and finally make the city and construct the ecosystem. And this is the image that I have of our proposed eco-city, and all the features are in red, which I won't go through right now. And then here we are. What I've put in the box at the bottom are aspects that I haven't got time to do it yet. This is my next agenda, besides improving what I've done with the earlier ones. And so in summary, designing has to be based on the science of ecology. We need to remake the built environment as construct ecosystems, and mimicry, design for mimicry by emulating, replicating, and augmenting ecosystem attributes.
So we've got a little bit of time for questions. There's going to be drinks afterwards, so if you want to leave early and grab some drinks, that's okay, but we've got a little bit of time for questions. I've got a few questions, and then we're going to open it up to the audience as well. And there is a roving microphone going around. But we're going to just have 10 minutes of questions before we open it up. So thank you, both of you, for discussing your work at some length and the approach that you've taken. It's clear that obviously nature is essential for supporting life on Earth, and yet as architects and designers, it's sort of rather ruled out. So I guess my first question, how do we actually enhance the value of nature and biodiversity to encourage our clients to want us to design for it? So, Amanda.
Well, I think, traditionally clients of buildings tend to take out, any sort of ecology or nature at the end of the project as the budget gets tight, right? So it typically ends up being removed. I think, with the growing awareness that our cities will have to play a role in resilience, in climate adaptation with a changing climate, and also, the impending sort of biodiversity collapse that I mentioned. I think, we're seeing programs like the, Nature Financial Disclosure Program that investors and developers are being required to disclose through their financing of projects. So I think there'll probably start to be some mandates that will require it. But in terms of, that's sort of the stick side of things. But in terms of the carrot, I think there's a lot of evidence that shows that, buildings that have a strong connection to nature are healthier for the occupants. A lot of tech companies, whether it be Google, Amazon, Facebook, have all been incorporating large aspects of biodiversity and nature in their projects because they see that there's better productivity and creativity of the occupants as well. So I think a big selling point often for clients is around sort of the benefits to human beings and how it can improve sort of health and wellness of the occupants, and that's often a driver for sort of incorporating more nature into projects.
So there is an obvious return on investment that is going to be fundamental to it. But also, of course, a lot of the work that you've been talking about, Ken, is about supporting the wider biodiversity, not just within the building, but within the realms of the building and the streetscape and the neighborhood and the wider urban realm. How do you believe we need to impress that upon clients to design for the wider biodiversity impact?
Well, it's been extremely difficult for me. Architecture is an old man's game, as I said. We started business back in 1976. I couldn't get a client to let me design an ecological building. I finished my doctorate in 1974. 76 I started design and couldn't. And so the easiest way we could get clients into what we do is to start designing passive low energy buildings, which are called bioclimatic buildings. So 76 to 96, I just did bioclimatic buildings. And I wrote books on it, I did studies on it, I did quantification of what it means. And then from 96 to, it's only after the 96 to 2006 that I have clients who come to me and says, oh, we want a green building. I said, that's very gratifying. And so, it took me about 30, 40 years. Of course, during that period, I continued to develop my work. I do research. I've written books about it. And that, I was talking to Norman the other day, this lordship, and he said, something happened in the 90s where people just jumped up and said, we have to do something about sustainability. And so everybody got into sustainability, especially the mechanical electrical engineers. And so, mechanical engineers suddenly became experts on sustainable systems. But it's a technologically driven approach. They forgot about ecology. And the other day I was in Amsterdam and I was looking across the waterfront, and somebody said to me, oh, those are 2 buildings done by Zaha. I said, they're jolly nice buildings, because I knew Zaha when she was still a student. And they said, they're green buildings. I said, they don't look very green to me, but they're LEED platinum. So what Zaha has done is she does buildings the way she would normally do, calling the engineers and said, make it green. So the engineers would comply with all the requirements for BREEAM, for LEED, and get platinum rating. But it's not really a green building because they forget nature. They forget about ecology. So now how do you convince clients? Well, some clients will listen to you and some clients won't. Most clients are concerned about money. So what I do when I get started on the project, I do the financial analysis for the client. I say, this is how much it costs to build, how much you can sell it. This is your profit, 21% and above, and this is your land cost. Now, and this is your budget for the building. If you agree to this, let me design to the budget. You may be an expert in building, but I've studied designing. Let me do what I want to do as a designer. It doesn't work all the time, some of the time, but that's what we do. But it's very gratifying that from 2006 onwards, it's much easier for me to persuade clients to do green buildings, and they put plants in the building.
So perhaps
it's an idea that grows on you.
So perhaps there is a need for greater evidence.
Sorry?
And I think there's a need for greater evidence. I mentioned at the beginning that biophilic design is an evidence-based approach, and we have 30 years of data and research that demonstrates that the inclusion of nature or mimics of nature can improve the quality and the experience and the performance of people within the building. But it seems that one of the things that we're not very good as architects and designers at doing is convincing our clients to contribute to that pool of knowledge and information. And this idea of post-occupancy evaluations to go, actually, it is good and it is important. How do we encourage our clients to kind of continue that pool of knowledge and to participate in post-occupancy evaluations? I think we all know it's important, but it's almost impossible to get to engage a client. But of course, so many benefits to it.
Yeah, I have previously convened a group of clients who have all brought nature into their buildings, and I know that they've done analysis to show how much more productive those spaces are, and also track sort of health outcomes and data for the occupants as well. But it becomes very tricky for them to share it because it can often be very personal information, including people's health data. But they've all said that, if there's a neutral party that they could feed the information to that was anonymized, that they would be willing to share it as a collective. So I think there's quite a lot of data out there from projects, but what it will take is, a neutral party that can kind of gather it and research for buildings. Especially around these kinds of areas is typically poorly funded. And so I think there's the will out there and there's data out there, but we don't have it really sort of captured or a way to sort of, make it more benchmarked across the industry. And I think it would really help because often, like you said, clients are interested in money and their largest cost of the tenants is typically their employees. It's way more expensive for them than the building is. So if you can make a cost argument, I think for us, that's not perhaps the reason to do it, but it can be a way to persuade clients to make the leap if they can see that there's a financial value. So having that data would be really fantastic. I think there's a need for it. I'd love to see sort of, a way to start gathering it and getting it out into the industry. But I do think that's quite true of many other data across green buildings as well. I think, having that information and understanding how you can pitch it to a client who may not have the same, ethics that we might have around why we might do it for the greater good of biodiversity, for example.
I mean, perhaps we are moving into an era where we are going to have a greater level of transparency in the way we build and the way that we understand buildings perform in order to, as a community, create buildings that are going to meet these enormous sort of climate targets that the built environment's going to have to meet. So, Ken.
Yes, sir.
It seems that there's a growing interest in sort of hyperlocalism, and it strikes me that the work that you're doing is looking at the kind of the local biodiversity matrix. What would you suggest to the architects and designers here to how might they start to do that, particularly in sort of dense urban environments?
Well, back to this earlier question about Klein. I just want to answer that first. The most common complaint I get from clients is maintenance. How do you maintain the vegetation in your buildings, inside the buildings and outside the buildings? And the answer is very simple. I call it the gardener index. When I finish a building, I say, this is a 1 gardener building, or 2 gardener building, or 3 gardener building. And gardeners' salaries are not very high. You just pay for the gardener, you pay for the replacement of the plants which have died, and the fill. So that's one of the way of answering the issue of maintenance. Now, what was your second question again?
It was really about hyperlocalism and how we're seeing buildings try to root themselves more closely to the local cultural and ecological systems.
Well, there are some people who are believers and some people who are not. And that we have to appreciate that if you don't do anything about the environment, we've got maybe 30, 50 years left. Not within my lifetime, but within the lifetime of most of the young people here. And so we've got to act now. And that this willingness to act is education. I can only do so much through lectures and educate people, but I don't have time to go and I can teach at schools sometimes. But there's a community of people whom I call behavioral changes. Through using the internet, they're able to change people's thinking, and just like Cambridge Analytics, able to change people to get to vote for Trump. Behavioral changes are people you need to get them to convince people to care for the environment, to put plants in buildings, because it enhances their well-being, it enhances their happiness, enhances their health. So that's not my remit. I don't have time to do this. I can only do so much. I'll leave it to the expert, which are behavioral changes, to do it. I can't do it.
So sort of shifting the question on a little bit to you, you talked about your project at Te Kurawari. Did I say that right?
Te Kurawari, yeah.
Quite close. What role do you think Indigenous expertise and experience influence the way you consider the built environment? And I can see that that's relevant in countries like New Zealand and Australia, but I find it much more difficult to kind of grasp hold of here in the UK, where it seems like a more distant culture.
Yeah, well,
so what advice would you give to UK architects and designers to kind of adapt and bring some of that expertise in?
I think there's a shrinking amount of biodiversity left in the world, and I guess fortunately a large portion of that is actually owned by Indigenous communities. So I think what we can learn from Indigenous communities is that about sort of the stewardship of place and ecology. And what I see across the UK is that, is actually a real eagerness with some of the rewilding initiatives to also increase the amount of biodiversity and connection to biodiversity in the UK as well. I think inherently what I've seen across the Indigenous communities that I've worked with is that there's not a sense of people and nature being separate, but just intricately connected, and there's a symbiotic relationship between the people and the ecosystems within which they're working. So I think, so your comment on hyper-localism, and I'm seeing that and become aware of some of the UK initiatives around sort of rewilding, where it's a similar sort of approach. So I think what we can really learn from Indigenous communities is that deep connection to the ecosystems, that deep understanding of how they work throughout seasons, throughout time, how each of the sort of, complexities, as Ken said, the hidden sort of work of, a thriving ecosystem that you often don't see, having a deeper understanding of how that works all the way down to soil health, right? And I think many Indigenous communities have that much richer connection than many others that have become a bit more distant from that have. So I think we can very much learn from our Indigenous communities about how to steward land. Often we're seeing too a rise for Indigenous communities of a change from ownership of land to stewardship of land. So the rights to nature is emerging, and I think we've traditionally, I think in the UK and throughout the colonies of the UK, got this sense that we have to own land, and we own it and it's ours, versus it being stewarded and taken care of for future generations and for the ability for the whole world to thrive. That's very much, I think, an Indigenous perspective. So I think all of us on planet Earth, before it's too late, and I'd suggest we don't even have 30 years before we see things changing radically based on the latest UN reports coming out in the last few days. So I think, all of us can take a lot of guidance and lessons from how Indigenous communities have worked symbiotically with their places.
Okay, so I've got one final question, and we're going to have some from the audience. Architecture and the way we conceive and develop and create buildings seems to be contrary to the way that nature develops within the environment, reacting and adapting to stimuli. Should buildings be rejecting notions of becoming a fixed product towards becoming a more flexible service-based approach? And you talked about a little bit about that with the Indigenous community. So should buildings just become more fluid and react more like nature, take perhaps a more biomimetic approach in their whole conception and evolution? Ken, do you have any thoughts on that?
Ken?
So basically buildings not as products but as a service that can adapt and change within the world around us.
Well, that's a way of looking at buildings. I won't disagree. But what's more important for me is that the community of architects have to change their mindset, right? I just read an article that David Chipperfield wrote, and he said that, it was an article, something I saw him speak on television. We have to change the way we design. We have to change the way we make buildings. Somebody like him, as a senior member of the profession, says that. And we have a room of about a few hundred people, and there's another few hundred people online. What is the impact of what Amanda and I said today will have on them? Maybe 10%, 20%, but we need 100% to change the mindset, okay? Getting people to change the mindset, to me, is a bit like bringing up children. There are three ways to bring up children. The first way to tell them children that do this, so the best way to tell people do things is to persuade them and to educate them. So you tell your children, do this for mommy and daddy because we love you. Not for any other reasons. And so we educate the child to do things, educate people, educate the community to do things because it is good for the environment. So that's the first strategy. The second is through incentive. If you look after the environment, you change your diet, you recycle your rubbish, your garbage. We give you incentive. You get tax breaks, you get higher plot ratio, you get fast approvals. So the second way to bring children up is to say, if you do this and this, you get extra pocket money. You get to use the car over the weekend, or you can go on holiday, with us. So that's the second way is bring up children. And the government should do the same. It's the government who has the power to do it, not you and me. We are just service industry, The third is through penalty. Tell a child, if you don't do this, you're grounded for the weekend or something like that, So the government should say, if you pollute the environment, you get taxed, you'll be put in jail, or you clear the land without looking into its ecological consequences, you'll be punished, you'll be taxed, you'll be penalized. So by persuasion is the best way, harmless. Second, through incentive, costs you a bit of dosh. The third is through a penalty. And this is how we change, but we are not in the position to do this. We're just service industry, right? We're not politicians. Politicians are the people with the power to do this. How do we get our politicians to do that? Architects should become politicians. One of the ministers in Singapore is an architect. The mayor of Penang is an architect. So, the architects can be in a position of power to do this, but they must have the inclination to want to do it. And to do that, you have to educate them. And that's the big effort, right? We can only do so much. Amanda will give a lecture and I'll say what I have to say, but how many of you in this room will leave the room and said, I've changed my mindset, I'm going to flip the switch, I'm going to do something about the environment, I'm going to study ecology, I'm going to change the way I design, I'm going to change the way we make buildings. How many of you will do it?
I think you put a pretty good argument for people wanting to do more and encourage and
mean distribution, mean distribution will tell you 60%, if you're lucky.
Well, I think also we're moving from the place where it's a choice to do it, where you can be persuaded, to where there will be much more requirement that we must do it. I never thought at the beginning of my architecture career that I would see investors and financiers leading in this space, but I now see them realizing that to invest or finance a building that isn't reaching, zero carbon, that doesn't have, net positive gain and biodiversity, is a really bad investment for the future. It's not a building that's going to be resilient to changing climate. It's not a building that's going to be able to potentially be operating in a high energy cost environment that we're already seeing. And so the finance and investment industry, I think, is starting to actually drive this sort of, requiring buildings that they invest in, especially, obviously new buildings, to really shift from what we're used to. So I've been surprised in the last 3 years to see the investor and finance community moving. And of course, there's all these zero carbon mandates as well, which I think we're not on track to really achieve any of them so far. So neither at city or country scale. So I think we'll increasingly see mandates. I think we'll see taxes on carbon. I think ultimately we'll hopefully see penalties around biodiversity loss as an impact as well. It would have been nice for us to have all moved, as an industry through persuasion and education over the last 30 years, but we haven't. And so I do think it's at the place where it'll be mandated and there'll be penalties in order for us to get there. That's what I've seen over the last 30 years.
We also have the passion, the education, the knowledge of a new generation who are growing up to realize they may perhaps be the most important generation of architects and designers to have ever lived, to have a real passion and purpose for doing something better.
Yes, absolutely.
So on that, we've got 1 minute 47. Forget the numbers. Let's have some questions from the audience. Margaret, we have Margaret walking around with a microphone over there. Could we have some hands up, please? Anybody have a question for Amanda or Ken? Well, I've got one question here. We'll come to you afterwards. Thank you.
Hello? Where do you see ecology and biophilic design fitting into retrofitting existing property? Obviously, with like landlords having to bring their houses up for the EPCs and that kind of thing. Like, how would that fit in?
This is a really important question because 80% of the built environment that we're going to have by 2050 already exists. So a lot of these beautiful ideas are going to have to be transitioned into the built environment.
Yeah, absolutely. I see it being, pretty integral because, a lot of buildings that have been built over the last sort of 50 years in particular are not very nice, right? They're not very nice for people. They're very large, fat buildings with not a lot of daylight in the middle. They're very separated from nature. And so I think especially as we see people, the last, few years with COVID, people have realized they actually like spending their day immersed in nature and outside. And I think there's just going to be increasing demand, and we will see buildings that don't allow that, I think, becoming less valued and more vacant. So I think we will see a rise of retrofits, and then there's an opportunity, right, to, I showed one project where it was a sort of mass of building additions that made this very dark, uninhabitable space, and we just cut a hole through the middle of it. And I think we'll see solutions like that allow buildings that we have now to be much more, operate a lot more efficiently and start to sort of unravel a more ecological approach.
Ken, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it's one of the approach might be one of budgeting. A lot of architects budget for artwork in the building, to set aside a certain sum within the original budget. So when you start with a project, you don't leap off and start designing, but you establish the budget with the client. How much the client can afford for the project, and what's the profit it's going to make, and what's the rental it's going to get. So a lot of clients budget for artwork. So in the same way we budget for artwork, we should budget for making buildings green. Now, the one building I showed in Singapore, the construction cost is 15% over industry standards for that building type. But the energy and water savings, and that's the main justification of green buildings to clients, is that within 8 years they amortize the cost, they get the money back. And so after 8 to 9 years, even though there's an enhanced capital cost, the building continues to save money through energy and water. And so, when you try and talk to a client, you tell them, this is the energy water savings per square foot that you get for your building, right? And to do this, you have to, this is the benefit of a green building. If you're able to convince that, and the client is thinking about money all the time, then you can tell them, sure, that's the initial high capital cost. You have to pay the interest with the capital cost. But over 5 to 8 years, you get your money back. Your capital, get your capital, your capex back. And so, after that, you continue savings. And so you could actually enhance efficiency of a building over time, if you let the architect do that. So these are one of the ways we can persuade the building.
I think we have another question down here.
I think my question is more specific to Dr. Yeang, which you spoke about the habitat, creations in your design process itself. I thought that was a really good idea to include it. But I suppose what I'd like to know is if there was a way to account for the day-to-day activities in the building affecting the growth of these habitats, like because you have people using the building, you have cellular networks, you have Wi-Fi. I don't know to what extent these things interfere with, the biodiversity and the integration of nature within the building. So, yeah, just your thoughts on that.
Well, actually, I didn't quite get your question because I've lost hearing in my left ear, so you're on the
Could you
left hand
summarise
side.
it again, a bit more briefly?
But
I suppose, how do we account for human activity within the building and the building itself, like the cellular networks, Wi-Fi, all of that? How do we account for that interfering with the biodiversity within the building and these ecosystems that are meant to grow? Does that make sense?
well, it's one of, again, persuading the users of the building to look after the building. If you want to have a garden at home, and most people want to have a garden at home, you have to tend to it, you have to look after it. You cannot just, if you want to put vegetation in buildings, you must be prepared to look after it. And
So is your point that we need to give people agency and ownership of nature to connect them to it? As Amanda mentioned, if we don't know it and understand it, it's very difficult to care about it and want its care for its conservation.
yeah, you have to use quantification to prove it. For instance, putting vegetation in buildings. Well, certain vegetation absorbs the VOCs, the volatile organic compounds. And so because of doing that, it enhances the quality of life within buildings and makes people work better. They're less likely to get sick or get ill, and they're more productive. And so, some of my friends who've done studies on biophilic design say that by biophilic design, it enhances the productivity of the people in buildings, and the cost of productivity is really salaries. And salary, actually, if you can save salary by making people more efficient, it's much more than saving money on buildings, because that's very small compared to salaries over a period of time. And so that's one of the ways of improving the environment through plants. E.O. Wilson, he wrote several books on biophilic design. And he did studies, I don't know if the audience knows about this. He did studies on, no, it's not E.O. Wilson, it's that surgeon that doctor in Texas. He found that people after operation, a group of patients would face a brick wall, and a group of patients would face vegetation. And those who face vegetation heal faster. So this I can't remember his name now. Do you know his name, Amanda? Aldrich or something like that, I think.
Yeah, he did that health.
Yeah, he's a doctor in Texas, and so there's proven facts that by facing vegetation, looking at vegetation every day, it improves the quality of your life, quality of your building. In the same way I said, by putting plants in buildings, reduce the volatile organic compounds in the interior, and it makes people healthier and more productive. So there are figures to show this. I don't know the exact figures. I haven't done an awful lot of research on biophilic design. But that's something that we should look into.
I think we've got time for one final question, because we are definitely over time. Gentleman here, please.
How do you see the possible use of, increase in use of timber as a structural element? You touched about that in one of your projects, over concrete, because you read articles where they say we're running out of sand to make concrete, and of course also concrete is, you mentioned it, terribly polluting, but I think here in England they're resisting construction in timber, whereas in France I think the law since 3, 4, 5 years ago is that buildings over a certain height have to incorporate a percentage of recyclable materials in the construction process, clearly greater than it is now. I just wonder how you see that evolving around the world, because clearly Singapore, for example, has committed recently or ongoingly to increase the number of trees in the country. But we're not in this place in the UK, I think.
Yeah, I'd be happy to talk a bit about that, because the organization that I lead, Built by Nature, we are currently focused on accelerating the use of mass timber in the building sector with a focus on Europe. So we actually have a quite active network here in the UK that's working to remove some of the barriers in the UK, which are predominantly around insurance after Grenfell in residential buildings. So the rest of Europe is actually not experiencing challenges with getting timber buildings insured, but the UK is. But we're actually funding through Built by Nature some initiatives that are working directly with the insurance sector here in the UK to overcome, hopefully, some of those barriers. I think timber has a tremendous potential, specifically at the moment in Europe and North America, to replace concrete. You might be aware of the Amsterdam municipal region has a 20% policy mandate to have 20% of their construction in the residential buildings to be out of timber. And there's a quite active program working with developers and asset owners in that region to make that realized. I'd love to see a 20% market share in Europe, and especially it's only about 40% of the forests that are fully utilized in Europe. There's actually a lot of capacity to grow timber for timber buildings sustainably in Europe. There's more timber right now that's actually burnt in biomass. So love to see that converted from biomass into buildings where you get the benefit not just of displacing the high intensity carbon concrete, but you also store carbon into the building for perhaps the life of the building, let's say average of 60 years, and then you grow more trees. So it's really a fantastic solution to decarbonize the built environment sector very quickly, and in the right context in Europe is also an opportunity for us to reforest sustainably and create a sustainable industry. It's not the right solution potentially everywhere in the global south of the tropics. In Australia, for example, eucalyptus is very difficult for mass timber. It's difficult to dry. There's people working on it. But I'm also working with some partners in Indonesia who are working similar with bamboo. So there's different solutions around the world. But I think, in Europe here, timber is a fantastic solution to move away from concrete and steel.
Plus, it has been proven to have physiological benefits. Children in classrooms have demonstrated heart rates of 8,600 beats per day less. People who sleep in real timber beds have reduced heart rate. So there is sort of some really fascinating studies that are starting to demonstrate the benefits of timber construction and the introduction of timber into the built environment, not just for the wider kind of natural environment, but also for the occupants of the spaces. So I think many, many benefits. So we have dramatically overstepped our stay here in the auditorium, but thank you for staying in your seats and for your questions. So it just leaves it to me to ask you to give a big round of applause for our two panelists, Dr. Ken and Amanda. Thank you for your insights, your expertise. It's been fascinating. I want to thank the RIBA for hosting the event, for Vitra Bathrooms for sponsoring it. And of course, the conversation goes on upstairs on the first floor in the Florence Hall, where there will be drinks with the sponsors. Amanda and Ken and myself will be there. So if you want to come and talk to us, ask us any of those other questions, or just some of those statements I've banned you from delivering tonight, please do come and talk to us. My name's Oliver Heath, and this has been Building a Biophilic Future. Thank you very much.